Dr. Kenji Yamamoto was a marine biologist operating aboard the Japanese research vessel Kaiyo Maru III, conducting cetacean population surveys in the Antarctic waters south of the 60th parallel, in a region where the ocean reaches depths that swallow sonar pings and return only silence, where the cold is not just temperature, but a physical presence that penetrates steel hulls and human bones with equal indifference. He had spent 17 years studying the migration patterns of minke whales, documenting their feeding behaviors in the krill-rich waters where the boundaries of nations dissolve into international territories governed by treaties that no one enforces with any real authority. He was a methodical man, the kind who kept duplicate logs and backed up his data on 3 separate hard drives, who understood that scientific credibility required documentation so thorough that skepticism would have no foothold. On March 14, 2019, at 0300 hours local time, he documented something that would end his career, destroy his reputation, and force him into a silence maintained not by professional ethics, but by threats delivered by men in dark suits who arrived on his doorstep exactly 48 hours after his ship docked in Yokohama. The Kaiyo Maru III was positioned at 71 degrees south latitude, conducting nighttime observations because the target species exhibited feeding patterns that intensified during the Antarctic summer's extended twilight hours. The research team had deployed hydrophones to track whale vocalizations, and the acoustic data was being monitored in real time by Dr. Yamamoto and his assistant, a graduate student named Hiroshi Tanaka, who would later claim in sealed testimony that he saw nothing, heard nothing, and had been asleep in his quarters during the entire incident despite ship logs that clearly indicated his presence in the observation room. The hydrophones began picking up anomalous sounds approximately 20 minutes before the visual contact, low-frequency vocalizations that did not match any catalogued whale species, clicking patterns that suggested echolocation, but at intensities and intervals that marine mammals do not produce, and beneath it all a sustained tone that Dr. Yamamoto would later describe as mechanical in its precision, but biological in its resonance, as if something massive was using sound not to navigate but to communicate, to broadcast its presence across distances that human technology struggles to comprehend. Dr. Yamamoto activated the ship's thermal imaging cameras, the high-resolution units mounted on the starboard observation deck that could detect temperature differentials at ranges exceeding 5 kilometers in optimal conditions. What appeared on the monitors was initially dismissed as equipment malfunction, a ghost image produced by the interaction of frigid Antarctic water and the ship's own heat signature reflecting off underwater terrain. But the image persisted, and it moved, ascending from depths that the ship's depth sounder indicated were in excess of 4,000 meters, rising at a rate that suggested active locomotion rather than passive buoyancy, approaching the surface with the kind of deliberate purpose that separated intentional movement from drift. The thermal signature was massive, 20 to 30 meters in length, but its shape defied categorization, humanoid in its general proportions, but impossibly scaled, with appendages that terminated in what looked like hands, not flippers or fins, but articulated digits that showed temperature variations indicating blood flow patterns, similar to warm-blooded mammals, but in a form that no mammal should possess. When it broke the surface, Dr. Yamamoto switched from thermal imaging to the low-light optical cameras, high-definition units capable of capturing detail in near darkness, and he began recording. The footage, which would later be classified under military secrecy laws despite being collected during civilian research operations, showed something that Japanese fishermen and Antarctic research crews had whispered about for decades, but which no official institution would acknowledge: the NINGEN, a word that translates roughly as human-like, a creature of ambiguous origin that moves through the Southern Ocean like a ghost, appearing in fragmented reports and blurred photographs that are always dismissed as icebergs, or whales filmed from misleading angles, or the misidentification of known animals by exhausted observers whose perception cannot be trusted after months in the isolation of polar research stations. The creature was white, not the white of ice or snow, but a pale luminescence that seemed to emanate from its skin. Bioluminescence similar to deep-sea organisms, but on a scale that dwarfed anything documented in scientific literature. Its body was cylindrical like a whale, but vertical in orientation, rising from the water with a posture that suggested it was standing rather than swimming, supported by appendages beneath the surface that the cameras could not fully capture. The head, if it could be called that, was smooth and featureless from a distance, but as Dr. Yamamoto zoomed the optical sensors to maximum magnification, details emerged that made his hands shake on the controls, details he would later struggle to articulate in the reports that were confiscated before he could submit them to any peer-reviewed journal. There were structures on the face that resembled eyes, dark patches that might have been sensory organs or simply pigmentation variations, and a horizontal line across what might be called the mouth region, though whether it was a mouth or simply a crease in the skin could not be determined from the footage before the creature descended again, sinking beneath the surface with the same deliberate control it had demonstrated during its ascent. The entire sighting lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, during which Dr. Yamamoto recorded continuously the digital files time-stamped and geotagged automatically by the camera's internal systems, creating a chain of evidence that would be both his vindication and his curse. Hiroshi Tanaka, who was indeed present in the observation room, despite his later denials, verbally confirmed what he was seeing, his voice captured on the audio track of the recording, saying repeatedly, "What is that? What is that?" with an escalating panic that suggested he understood, even in that moment, that they were documenting something that should not exist according to the comfortable categories into which science sorts the natural world. When the creature disappeared, Dr. Yamamoto immediately began backing up the footage, copying files to multiple drives, following protocols designed for valuable data that might be lost to equipment failure or accident, not anticipating that the real threat would come from human hands rather than technological malfunction. If you have ever encountered something that defied explanation, something that made you question whether our understanding of the ocean is fundamentally incomplete or willfully ignorant, share your theories in the comments below. Because what happened to Dr. Yamamoto in the hours and days following this recording suggests that there are institutions with resources and authority dedicated not to discovering what lies in the deep ocean, but to ensuring that certain discoveries remain permanently classified, buried under layers of secrecy that protect not national security but a narrative about our world that cannot accommodate the existence of creatures that bridge the impossible space between myth and biology. The Kaiyo Maru III continued its survey operations for another 36 hours before receiving an encrypted communication from the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, instructing the vessel to terminate current research protocols and return immediately to port, a directive that violated standard operational procedures and raised immediate suspicion among the crew, who understood that emergency recalls occurred only in response to equipment failure, medical emergencies, or political situations requiring the rapid redeployment of research assets. Dr. Yamamoto was informed that his data would be reviewed upon arrival and that he was to make no external communications regarding his recent observations until the review process was completed, language that seemed reasonable in the context of scientific validation, but which carried undertones that his 17 years of experience recognized as unusual, as crossing the boundary from professional protocol into something else, something that made the ship's atmosphere feel heavier, more oppressive, as if the entire crew sensed that they were returning not to debriefing, but to reckoning. When the Kaiyo Maru III docked in Yokohama 2 days later, the standard disembarkation process was interrupted by the presence of personnel who were not affiliated with any research institution. Dr. Yamamoto recognized men in dark suits who presented identification from the Ministry of Defense rather than from scientific agencies, who boarded the vessel before the crew was allowed to leave and proceeded directly to the observation room where Dr. Yamamoto had been instructed to wait with all of his recording equipment and data storage devices. They did not ask for the footage, they confiscated it, using language from national security statutes that grant military authorities the right to seize materials deemed relevant to defense interests. A legal framework designed for weapons technology and intelligence gathering, but which was being applied with clinical efficiency to 4 minutes of video showing a creature in international waters that posed no conceivable threat to Japan or any other nation unless the true threat was not what the creature might do, but what its existence would prove. The confiscation was thorough to the point of paranoia. They took the original recordings, all backup copies, the hard drives, the cameras themselves, despite having already extracted the data, even Dr. Yamamoto's personal laptop and phone, which contained no research materials, but which apparently could not be trusted to remain in his possession. They required him to sign documents that acknowledged he had surrendered the materials voluntarily, that he understood the classified nature of what he had recorded, and that he agreed to make no public statements or private communications regarding the incident under penalty of prosecution for violations of state secrecy laws that carried prison sentences measured in years rather than months. And they informed him, with the flat effect of men delivering routine information rather than threats, that his research vessel privileges were under review, that his funding sources would be notified of potential security concerns, and that his continued employment depended on his cooperation with an investigation whose parameters would not be explained and whose conclusions would not be shared with him, regardless of their findings. Dr. Yamamoto cooperated, signed what they put in front of him, handed over materials he had spent 17 years learning to protect and preserve, because the alternative was imprisonment or worse, because he had seen the complete absence of sympathy in the eyes of men who viewed him not as a scientist who had made a significant discovery, but as a problem that needed to be contained. Hiroshi Tanaka was processed separately, and when Dr. Yamamoto encountered him briefly in the corridor before being escorted off the vessel, the young man would not meet his eyes, would not acknowledge him, walking past as if his mentor had ceased to exist. And Dr. Yamamoto understood that whatever pressure had been applied to secure his silence had been applied even more intensely to someone whose career was just beginning, and who had everything to lose by refusing to forget what he had witnessed. The aftermath was systematic destruction, masquerading as bureaucratic process. Within a week, Dr. Yamamoto's research position was terminated through a reorganization that eliminated his entire department, consolidating its functions under different leadership that declined to retain his services due to budgetary constraints that were not explained in detail because details would have revealed that his termination was targeted rather than incidental. His academic credentials remained intact, but employment opportunities evaporated when background checks revealed his involvement in classified security matters, language that sounded ominous to potential employers who preferred candidates without complications that might attract unwanted governmental attention. His reputation within the scientific community, carefully built over 2 decades of methodical research and peer-reviewed publications, collapsed when rumors began circulating that he had been dismissed for fabricating data, for violating research ethics, for any number of vague infractions that were never formally charged, but which carried enough weight in whispered conversations to ensure that his name became associated with unreliability rather than discovery. He attempted to speak, to share his experience with journalists, with documentary producers, with anyone who might help him tell the truth about what he had recorded and what had been done to silence him. But he found that the people willing to listen were not the people with platforms that mattered, were conspiracy theorists and fringe media outlets whose association would only further damage his credibility, while mainstream institutions refused to cover a story that involved classified military actions and allegations of government cover-ups without corroborating evidence that had been confiscated and would never be returned. He learned that truth without proof is indistinguishable from delusion, that witnessing something extraordinary grants no authority if the evidence of that witnessing is seized and hidden behind classification levels that prohibit even acknowledging that the classification exists. If this account disturbs you, if it suggests that there are things in the ocean whose existence is known to institutions with the power to enforce silence, then you must act to keep channels like this alive, to keep these testimonies in circulation, to ensure that stories like Dr. Yamamoto's reach audiences who can hear them and decide for themselves what they mean. Subscribe, share this content, not for entertainment, but for preservation, because the suppression of information is only successful when people stop seeking, stop questioning, stop demanding answers to mysteries that powerful institutions would prefer remain permanently buried beneath classification stamps and threats of prosecution. Stay warned about what really lives beneath the surface, because that warning is the only protection available to those who venture into waters where the boundaries between known and unknown dissolve, where creatures exist that our science cannot accommodate and our governments will not acknowledge. Dr. Yamamoto lives now in a small apartment in a suburb of Tokyo, unemployed despite his qualifications, financially supported by family members who believe he suffered a breakdown rather than a revelation, who think his stories about government conspiracies and Antarctic cryptids are symptoms of psychological damage that requires medication and therapy rather than evidence of truths that institutions work tirelessly to suppress. He maintains that the Ningen is real, that his footage proved its existence beyond any reasonable doubt, and that the response of the Ministry of Defense validated rather than refuted his claims, because innocent governments do not deploy military personnel to confiscate civilian research data unless that data documents something they desperately need to keep hidden. He has no proof now, nothing but memory of 4 minutes during which he filmed something that should not exist, memory that has been dismissed and ridiculed and pathologized until even he sometimes wonders if what he saw was real or if the cold and isolation of Antarctic research had affected his perception in ways he cannot acknowledge. But late at night, when the sounds of the city fade and his apartment is silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant vibration of trains moving underground, Dr. Yamamoto hears again the acoustic signature that preceded the visual contact, that low-frequency vocalization that did not match any known species, and he knows with absolute certainty that what he recorded was genuine, that somewhere in the Antarctic waters south of the 60th parallel, creatures move through the deep that dwarf human understanding, that possess intelligence or awareness or purpose we cannot measure, and that governments know this, have known this for decades, and have made the calculated decision that humanity is not ready or not worthy of this knowledge. that the truth must be suppressed through confiscation and threats and the systematic destruction of careers of anyone who comes too close to documenting what swims in the cold darkness, where our maps end and our instruments fail, and the only certainty is that we are being watched by eyes that see us more clearly than we can see them, watched by intelligences that have decided, for reasons we cannot begin to comprehend, that they are not yet ready to be known, not yet ready to emerge from the depths where they have hidden for millennia, waiting for a moment that has not yet arrived, but which draws closer with each expedition that ventures too far into territories that were never meant for human observation, territories where the Ningen swim and surface and sink again, leaving behind nothing but brief sightings and confiscated footage, and scientists whose lives are destroyed for the crime of seeing what they were not supposed to see and attempting to share it with a world that would rather believe they are lying or insane than accept that the ocean is stranger and more populated with mystery than our comfortable certainties can accommodate.